When competing in a tournament series which travels across countries and continents, adjusting to time zones and jet lag isn't an inconvenience. It's a real game changer. And the teams that can adjust the quickest have a real edge on the field. Sevens rugby is already one of the most physically demanding sports in the world. But imagine trying to sprint at full speed for 14 minutes across multiple games when your body thinks it's 3 a.m. That's the reality for athletes bouncing between time zones. Hong Kong to Cape Town, Perth to Los Angeles. But what is the science behind jet lag? And how does it impact the performance of athletes? And what methods are used to battle it and stay on top form? Welcome to the report. Simply put, jet lag messes with our circadian rhythm, the body's internal clock, which is influenced by certain changes in environment like eating, sleeping, and daylight. This can lead to fatigue, reduced reaction time, and even an increased risk of injury. Not ideal for the grueling world of sevens.
We have in our brains this area that's kind of like the master timekeeper. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, if you're interested. And its job is to synchronize all these different body functions: hormone release, body temperature, appetite, gastrointestinal function, obviously sleep. And it does that by taking into account light and day. And the moment you cross time zones, you shift those internal body clock signals differently from the time of day. And it takes a while, between 5 and 7 days, for things to catch up and reset to the new time zone. And that's what we experience as jet lag.
So how do teams combat jet lag? Managing key factors such as hydration, sleeping, and nutrition are absolutely crucial to staying on the top of your game. But there's no magic fix. Teams use tactics such as strategic napping, adjusting to light exposure, and even diet days in advance. And yes, caffeine plays its part. The teams that adapt the quickest have a real edge on the field. You can train for months, but if your body isn't firing at the right time, you're at a huge disadvantage, especially in a sport as fast-paced and demanding as sevens. But how much of a disadvantage is it? And what might that look like?
Let's say you have a player who's traveled from London to Sydney, or from South Africa to Sydney, and the time on their phone says 10 p.m. But the problem is their body clock is still set to London or South Africa time, which means it's mid-afternoon. So now this person has to go to bed in what is for them physiologically mid-afternoon. And then the very next morning they wake up and the clock is saying 6 a.m., but their body's telling them it's 9 p.m. And so now they've got to wake up at the very moment they have to sleep.
If I was awake at 3 in the morning before my first tournament, I just assumed I was nervous. I had no idea that was because in Australia it's midday or whatever it is. Like, I just didn't think too deeply about it because I didn't know anything about it.
Can you imagine an athlete now who's not sleeping properly, who's had travel fatigue on top of jet lag, is going to see some compromised performance. And there are a number of studies that have looked at this, and they find cognitive issues, so how we think and process information, problem solving. There's also studies that have shown that their physical ability is down. They measure something called a counter movement jump, which is where the athlete drops down and then bounces up as high as they can. And that's widely considered to be the best test of explosive power. Pretty much across the board, studies have found that that is lower. So imagine you're a sevens player now, and I tell you that you're 10%, 15% less powerful. That means your ability to make line breaks, your ability to evade tackles, your ability to dominate contact if you're the tackler are all going to be suppressed. And so then there's got to be an injury risk to that as well. And so it's a really delicate system to try and balance if you're the coach or the player of a team that's traveled across multiple time zones.
Preparation for jet lag starts long before the flight. Some teams even start preparing a week before they travel. That means earlier wake-up times, blue light exposure therapy, and even changing their diet based around the destination. Certain foods help players reset their body clock. High-protein meals in the morning to keep them wide awake and alert, and slow digesting carbs at night to make sure they have a good night's rest. And here's a big one: blue light. Not ideal at the best of times, especially when you're competing. Many teams actually enforce screen curfews to help players fall asleep faster. That means less scrolling, more snoozing.
If you're not sleeping, you're not recovering, bottom line. And so teams will use things like melatonin. They'll try and force players into the new time zone as quickly as possible. But like everything in high performance, there's a trade-off. You take sleeping tablets to force the player to sleep, but the sleep's not good. Maybe they feel drowsy and groggy the next morning when it's time to train.
Eddie Jones would just say, okay, head out, do whatever you need to do, but the next day we'll get together, we have a bit of fitness games, you sweat it out, and the one rule is you just can't go to sleep. And that seemed to work.
If you know that you've got very limited time at your new destination, some teams will say that they're not even going to try and get onto the new time zone. So they're going to live in the destination as if they were in the source. So we will play the match at 3 p.m, but in our bodies we'll accept that it's 5 a.m.
But are certain teams on the tour at more of a disadvantage than others?
There's probably not another sports series or event in the world that asks players to do as much travel stress as Sevens does. And because it's so rare, there's not as much research as you'd need to precisely say that one time zone per day is worth 2 points. We do know, though, for instance, that in baseball in the United States, teams that travel from the West Coast to the East Coast or vice versa are 10% less likely to win, and the home team is 10% more likely to win. So that's a 20-point swing. The difference created by travel is often bigger than the difference between two teams, and so it can be decisive to the result.
In the 2024-25 season, there were no European legs across the entirety of the HSBC 7 Series. So that guaranteed long flights and brutal time zone changes for the likes of GB, Ireland, Spain and France. However, travelling furthest over the season and at most risk of jet lag impact were Uruguay, Argentina and Kenya for the men's, and Brazil, Fiji and Spain for the women's. The likes of Australia, for example, they have the most extreme swings of time zones when they play in Vancouver and Los Angeles, but the tournaments in Perth, Singapore and Hong Kong all exist on the same time zone, meaning no extreme periods of adjustment, making their risk of jet lag performance impact relatively lower risk than other nations.
And so what World Rugby's tried to do within reason is that when teams have got particularly high travel stress, World Rugby covers an additional night in the destination city. And the idea behind that is to give them one extra day to try and get back to normal, as it were, back to baseline. Clearly, if everyone gets 3 days, there's a lack of parity there. And so there's been this attempt to create at least some kind of level playing field.
Rugby Sevens is all about speed, skill and endurance. But when you add in the global travel element, it becomes a whole nother game. It's not just about who plays the best rugby, it's about who can adapt to the unique challenges that this sport shows up. I'm Harry McNulty, and that was a report.